And joining us here in studio is John Kotek, the Assistant Secretary at the Office of Nuclear Energy and also the President's nominee to fill that position officially. Thank you so much for being here, John.
Thanks for having me.
First of all, I just wanted to pick your brain a little bit about what the INL and its role is, not just here in Idaho, but to the nation.
Certainly. So the INL is first and foremost the nation's lead laboratory for nuclear energy R&D. Okay? But the lab does much more than that. For example, the lab has extensive programs in clean energy research. For example, commercial scale geothermal power was pioneered at the Idaho National Laboratory. These days, there's a lot of work focused on, for example, biomass and biofuels, right? So developing energy products from crops. There's also an extensive national and homeland security program over there. So working on things like cybersecurity and work for the Department of Homeland Security. On the nuclear energy research mission, I mentioned that it's our lead laboratory for that. The lab really has its roots in nuclear energy R&D. So if you go back to 1949, the National Reactor Testing Station was established, all right, at what is now called the Idaho National Laboratory site. Over the years, there have been more than 50 reactors, research reactors and test reactors built on the site. Wide variety of work on developing nuclear reactor fuels, nuclear materials, testing out safety systems, you name it. These days, there's still 3 operating nuclear reactors over there, small ones, not power-sized reactors, but ones we use for testing and research. And even to this day, we do a wide variety of work on developing safer and more efficient nuclear reactor fuels, for example, developing materials that can withstand higher temperatures or corrosive environments or what have you to try to advance the state of reactor technology so that we have nuclear energy available as an option to meet our clean energy needs today, tomorrow, and into the long-term future. So for example, we're looking at things like, can we develop reactors that not only provide electricity, which is what the vast majority of today's reactors are used for, but to supply process heat for chemical systems, to produce hydrogen for transportation or as a chemical feedstock, to provide desalination services given the increasing concerns over water availability. So a whole wide range of nuclear energy research really forms the core of the laboratory.
Yeah, absolutely. The question I had was really on how big the research R&D section is of the INL versus the cleanup side of that. Okay. I think a lot of attention, and we always hear about the cleanup that's going on out there, but in 2035 or whenever that comes to a close, how much of the INL will still be intact, and do you see it have legs beyond 2035?
So the laboratory itself is nearly $1 billion a year institution, $900 million to $1 billion a year, roughly 4,000 people, maybe a little bit south of that right now. The cleanup program is $300 and something million a year. And I should clarify that my organization is responsible for the research side. We've got a separate organization in DOE that's responsible for the cleanup piece. And then there's also an extensive U.S. nuclear Navy presence there on the site. So all told, you're talking about on the order of 7,000 people over there, more than half of which work at the laboratory. So even as the cleanup program gets wrapped up over the coming decades, there's still a very vibrant, robust, and pretty substantial research agenda that's being carried out there at the lab.
Now you said that your organization is separate than the cleanup. You're responsible for R&D. That said, because of the governor's agreement, your side is also dependent on that getting cleaned up. Now, have there been meaningful talks between DOE and the Attorney General's office to advance that happening under the BAT agreement?
Yes, and as the Attorney General said in a talk he gave over in Idaho Falls last week, we are in the midst of discussions right now.
How important is that? The shipment of those commercial spent fuel to Idaho. How important is that to the DOE? And we heard back in July that you said something to the effect of we need to have a decision in roughly 2 months from now. We have gotten to that point. Maybe if you could explain that a little deeper.
Yeah, sure. Well, first to the importance of the work. So there are 2 proposals on the table right now. So 2 projects DOE, frankly, has offered first to the state of Idaho. One is focused on demonstrating the long-term safety of certain types of fuel, what we call high burn-up fuel, which is an advanced type of reactor fuel currently in use, to ensure that it can remain safe in dry storage over the long term. So this is a cooperative effort between us and some of the biggest players in the nuclear industry. So Westinghouse, Areva, the Electric Power Research Institute, and others are participants in that program. That's a project we want to get started with a fuel shipment in January of next year. Okay, and so we need to make a decision here in the relatively near term. And that's what, when I was asked a couple of months ago, I said we need to make a decision in about 2 months. That's what was driving that, my response. The other project is one that is part of what we call a joint fuel cycle study, which is looking at ways of treating fuel so that you can minimize waste generation and maybe make more effective use of the resource that still exists in the fuel. So there are 2 separate shipments, each of which would be basically the same size. Each is about 50 kilograms of fuel, so the 2 combined would be about 100 kilograms, about 220 pounds of material that we want to bring in. There have been some questions about, well, doesn't this mean you're trying to bring this spent fuel into the state and dump it on us or something? Each of these shipments represents less than 1/1,000,000th of the nation's spent fuel inventory. All right, so this is not a large amount of material. There's about 75,000 metric tons of spent fuel in storage at various locations around the country. There's currently about 300 metric tons here in Idaho, a combination of fuel from the Navy and then fuel from various DOE research activities over the years. And so, this is about research. This isn't about material that doesn't have another place to go. This is about us selecting material that we want to examine and study and provide useful data to help support our nuclear energy R&D programs.
Now, you say the Department of Energy offered this to the state of Idaho. Mm-hmm. Other people have classified it differently, as the Department of Energy is trying to foist this on Idaho. And not only that, but the Attorney General, who was one of the 3 signatories on the agreement, has said that he wasn't properly engaged on this until other people had already been in talks. So do you think that this discussion could have gone better?
Sure. I think we're at a state now where each side understands where the other is and what the concerns are and what have you. And so now we'll see if it's possible to reach some sort of an agreement. I say we've offered this to the state because we have other places in the complex where we can do this work, and particularly the first shipment I'm talking about. And so, but because Idaho is our lead laboratory for nuclear energy research, that naturally this is the place we look to first, because you mentioned the cleanup commitments in the settlement agreement, and that's very important, and it governs a lot of what is done at the site. There's another commitment that we have to the state of Idaho, which goes back at least to 1999, which was to establish and build the nation's leading nuclear energy R&D laboratory here at the site. And one of the ways you do that is you bring in research programs, you bring in facilities and infrastructure and capability, and you bring in people. So people, programs, facilities is what makes a national laboratory great. Part of making the Idaho National Laboratory into the nation's leading nuclear energy R&D lab and into a world-class nuclear energy R&D facility is to have an engaged in cutting-edge research like this that's very important either to government missions or to the commercial sector. And so what we'd like to do, and what we've done over the last 10 years, for example, since the contract was let for the Idaho National Laboratory, is we've invested almost $500 million in facilities and other infrastructure, research equipment, for example, to try and build out the set of capabilities that exists here at the laboratory. That in turn attracts programs, it attracts world-class people who want to come and work on those programs and use those capabilities here at the lab. So this is part of the evolution of turning this into, or continuing along this path of building a world-class nuclear energy R&D laboratory.
What does this mean for the INL? We heard in September a letter that started making its rounds here in the state, and that is, if we don't take the 2 shipments of spent commercial nuclear waste, that this could undermine the role of the Idaho National Lab. Is that possible? And how quickly would the Department of Energy be willing to take those shipments and send them somewhere else, and where would they go?
Well, so the letter you referred to, I think, is a letter that was sent by the Line Commission, which the Leadership in Nuclear Energy Commission, which was established by the governor, I think, in 2012. to look at Idaho's ongoing role in things nuclear, right? And so, folks in eastern Idaho, where I lived for 12 years, they get this stuff. Here, over here in Boise, or maybe up north, it's not as front and center. But the first commercial generation, or first generation of usable electricity from nuclear power came from Idaho, right? The work that's been done to allow the Navy to develop fuel that now lasts the life of the ship, that was done here in Idaho. A lot of the big groundbreaking safety tests done after the 3 Mile Island accident were done here in Idaho. I mean, there's this long history of Idaho leading in nuclear energy technology development. So when you look at where nuclear energy technology development is going these days, a lot of the attention is on research around better and better commercial fuel types. So I talked about this high burn-up fuel, for example, right? It's a fuel that can stay in a reactor 5 or 6 years. When nuclear was in its infancy, fuel would stay in the reactor for a year or two, okay, before you had to take it out and refuel. So we're getting much more efficient generation out of today's fuel types, okay? A lot of the work that was done to allow that to happen actually came out of, stems from research done here at the Idaho National Lab. Looking forward, we're trying to develop things like accident-tolerant fuels. Okay, so a fuel type that gives an operator more time to respond in the event of a nuclear incident. Okay, and so hopefully you give that operator time to ensure that you don't have the type of fuel melting that occurred at 3 Mile Island back in the late 70s, for example. And so what ultimately will happen there is, as we go from where we are today, which is developing a variety of different types and samples that we will then test and see what look to be the most promising types, ultimately you're going to have fuel go into a reactor. You'll irradiate some test rods. You'll want to bring those somewhere. Not a lot, all right, a handful. And do the examination on those. Well, I'd love for Idaho to be the place that does that work, but because of the nature of the DOE complex, because of the fact that we've got nuclear capabilities around the complex, there are other places that could do that work and would like to do that work. But so we've brought this to Idaho first as our lead laboratory, but if the state decides, in this case it's the Attorney General, because the governor and the entire congressional delegation have been extremely supportive of us through this whole process. But if the decision is made that they want to turn that away, then we'll go elsewhere in the complex.
Now, you talk a lot about how important research and development is, and it is, but you still have the issue of the waste that is sitting there. You still have the issue of the missed deadlines. And I know that this isn't necessarily your purview, but under the BAT agreement, that's the state's only way to get the federal government to do its job and to clean up the waste. And so if we accept this waste, what other recourse are we going to have to get the federal government to meet its deadlines?
Well, and first of all, you keep calling it waste. I call it research material. This is not something that otherwise has no place to go. Okay, this is material that we want to bring here so that the scientists at the lab can use the world-class capabilities that we built at the lab to generate the data that we need. So I think that's
more accurate. Spent fuel rods is neutral.
I think
spent
that's
fuel rods.
I think that's
right.
I think that's a much more accurate way to portray it. With respect to the settlement agreement, that yes, unfortunately we are behind on a couple of the cleanup milestones embodied in that agreement. Which is too bad because if you look at the history over the last 20 plus years of DOE's cleanup record, we've met more than 99% of the milestones embodied in the various agreements that we've got. We've invested upwards of $8 billion in the cleanup project, again over the 20-year period. We've moved 98% of the fuel on the site from wet storage into dry storage. We've taken down about 2 million square feet of unneeded facilities. There's been a lot of work that's gone on to ensure that people in the environment are protected, and I give a lot of credit to the governors in Anderson Bat for what became the settlement agreement, because what it did was it helped build a level of confidence between DOE and the state, held DOE's feet to the fire on the cleanup, and it allowed us to get to a level of cooperation where the Department of Energy was comfortable investing large sums in the national lab and naming the Idaho National Lab its lead laboratory for nuclear energy R&D.
But
so
if you're going to get people confident to say this, right now, as you probably are well aware, WIPP is not accepting due to a fire a couple of years ago, and Yucca Mountain, which is the national repository for spent commercial fuel, that is kind of going nowhere at this point. We don't have a repository in mind yet.
Yeah, and so let me talk about the two things. While WIPP, so the WIPP Waste Isolation Pilot Plant, for your viewers who might not be familiar with it, facility in New Mexico that since 1999 has been accepting what we call transuranic waste, so wastes that were largely those generated through the weapons program. Materials have been disposed there in a mined repository 2,100 feet underground in salt. Right, that was closed down. I think it was back in 2014. And what we've done here in Idaho since then is we've continued to exhume waste either from the subsurface or take it out of berms where we've had it stored over the years to get it into safe storage. Because the most important thing, of course, is make sure that people in the environment are protected from this material. Right. So continuing that process and getting it ready for shipment when WIPP reopens is the thing we can do right now, and so that work's continuing. You mentioned Yucca Mountain, and let's clarify on that. So that was supposed to be under the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1987. That was the facility chosen to be characterized for establishing a repository for spent fuel and high-level waste. My boss, Secretary Moniz, and his predecessor had determined that was no longer a workable site. The state of Nevada has objected at every turn, as you may know. It was originally supposed to be open in 1998, and certainly hasn't. So it never went into operation. Some people have the impression that it accepted waste. Over the years, it didn't.
Right.
It was still quite some time away from operating.
But we spent a lot of money developing that. Yeah. And the question here is, we do have a place where we're digging old transuranic waste. We're sending it to a place, but there's no place for spent fuel right now, commercial spent fuel to go anywhere.
And so what we do is, first let me talk about what we're doing in the Yucca Mountain, because that does fall into my office's responsibility. Back in 2010, the President directed the Secretary of Energy to form what he called the Blue Ribbon Commission on America's Nuclear Future, looking at, and he chartered the commission with developing a new strategy for dealing with spent fuel and high-level waste in the U.S. And I was the staff director to that commission, and Secretary Moniz served on it. So it was an opportunity for us to work very closely together to develop a set of recommendations that were really focused on the need to have informed consent by whatever state or states were ultimately going to accept this material for disposal. And so what we're doing now is we're in the process of standing up what we call a consent-based siting process, where we will provide information, other resources to state, tribal, local governments that are interested in considering whether to host a facility for the storage or disposal of either commercial waste or defense waste. And then we will work cooperatively with them to determine whether in fact they're interested and help them answer what I consider is the key question, which is, can we do this in a way that's fully protective of our people and the environment? If they can convince themselves that that's the case, then can this be done in a way that the state, the tribe, the local government feel like they're better off for having done it? So we're embarking on a process to get to what we call a willing and informed host, with which we can strike a durable agreement. There have been several attempts by the federal government to force states that didn't want this material to take it. And that sort of top-down approach hasn't worked. We think we need to work cooperatively with states. So that's another one of the things that I'm working on in addition to the nuclear energy R&D mission.
What's your timeline on that? When will we start hearing, we've got a few sites in mind, we're just trying to work out the compromise?
Yeah, and we haven't started the siting process yet, although we're working towards that. What I think I look at the Canadians as a model. For example, the Canadians had a very top-down program like we had, where they were out looking for sites, and they'd show up in some community with drilling rigs and seismic equipment, and folks would say, "What are you up to?" And they're saying, "Well, we're looking for a place to put nuclear waste," right? And that didn't go over so well. So they then started a process through which, again, they provided information, other resources to communities that were potentially interested in being part of the solution. They had 22 communities step forward at the beginning of their process to express some interest. Of course, some of them backed out. Some of them have been filtered out because they didn't meet one criterion or another. But they're still working with either 8 or 9 communities right now, seriously looking at whether these communities could be host sites. So you're talking about a country with a similar size as the U.S. I'm optimistic we can get to the point where we've got similar numbers of communities at least expressing an interest in this.
So, bottom line, going back to the spent fuel rods, if we don't take them in January, where do they end up?
So I will wind up having to send them to another DOE laboratory. There are a few that have capability. We've got one in Tennessee. We've got one in South Carolina. There are others around the system that have the capability to do at least part of the work that we have planned here. So we haven't made a decision as to exactly where it would go if we don't bring it here, but there are other places in the complex that could take it.
What's the timeline on that, as far as if we don't make a decision by January, how long before it gets sent to Tennessee?
So January is when we're going to make the shipment. So we need to make a decision here in the next couple of weeks, I'd say, if not sooner, as to when we're going to, or where we're going to make that first shipment. I mentioned there's a second shipment. That's one that we would do in February. I've got a little more flexibility on that one, because with the first one, we've got industry partners that we're working with. We've got a project schedule that we need to keep to. The second one, I've got a little more flexibility because it's largely a government mission.
Right now, are you confident that Idaho and the Department of Energy can hammer out a deal this month?
I'm confident we can sit down and speak clearly about each of our positions. We'll have to see. That still remains to be seen as to whether we can find an agreement.
Yeah, talking about the BAT agreement, is it outdated? It was formed back in 1995. We've had a few revisions to that. We've had some memorandum of understanding to bring in certain amounts of research grade spent fuel. But do we need to look at the BAT agreement today and say, let's bring it up to today's standards?
That's the department has not taken a position on that. I do know, having served on the Line Commission starting in 2012, that was certainly part of the conversation that was being had in some of the discussions within the Line Commission. With the recognition that 20 years ago, when DOE wanted to ship spent fuel in here into Idaho, it was because it wanted to clean places out like the West Valley site in New York. These days, when you're talking about research materials coming in, it's for a different purpose. But so I know the Line Commission has had that conversation, but like I said, we in DOE haven't taken a position on it.
You're the president's nominee to fulfill the shoes that you're already in. How's that process going? Are you pretty confident that you'll be confirmed by the Senate here soon?
I first of all, let me say I'm thrilled to have been asked, been nominated. I mentioned before I've worked with the Secretary of Energy extensively in the past in the Blue Ribbon Commission, and I appreciate the confidence that he's shown in me. I was very pleased to see that last week the entire Idaho congressional delegation issued a statement of support for my nomination. So that was very much appreciated. Actually have a confirmation hearing scheduled for next week, and so really after that will I know how it's going.
Well, I'm curious, with that in mind, just to wrap up, if you get this job, what's your vision for nuclear energy? Where do we go from here?
So nuclear is an important component in what the President and the Secretary of Energy call the all-of-the-above energy strategy. So there's I think, a growing understanding of the benefits of what we call decarbonizing the electricity system. So moving away from fossil fuels, not going to happen overnight, but as a long-term vision. And having low carbon options like nuclear, wind, solar, geothermal, what have you, available to meet growing electricity demand. Here in the U.S., of course, we've seen electricity demand relatively flat. Energy conservation is starting to take better hold, what have you. You look at other nations, China and India are excellent examples, right? They are trying to meet rapidly growing electricity demands and providing alternatives that generate essentially no carbon will be an important part of that future. So what we're trying to do is, in the near term in the U.S., we're trying to help the utility industry keep current plants running. Of course, there are 99 commercial nuclear reactors in the U.S., provide about 20% of our electricity, 5 more under construction around the country, so a pretty good chunk of electrical generation. In the relatively near term, in the next 10 years or so, create other offerings like things we call small modular reactors, right? A reactor that might be a better fit for a utility or a region that doesn't need a 1,000 megawatt nuclear plant, but might be well served by a 200 megawatt facility. And that those types of reactors might have great applicability overseas as well, for example, with countries that don't have as expansive a grid as we have here in the U.S., for example. And then over the long term, trying to develop reactor technologies that maybe go beyond today's water-cooled reactors and have reactors cooled by gases or sodium or liquid salts or other alternatives that might provide opportunities for more economical, safer, and more efficient generation of nuclear power. So the INL is going to be engaged in that wide range of research, I hope, for decades to come.
What's it like working with the Obama administration? Nuclear energy has long been thought a Republican issue. Democrats tend not to be as accepting of nuclear energy. So I guess I'm curious right now, being in these shoes that you're in now, how's it working with the Obama administration?
Yeah, I'd say certainly, you've mentioned there may be more skeptics on the left when it comes to things nuclear, but this administration is the one that, for example, just finished the loan guarantees for the construction of the 2 new nuclear units in the state of Georgia. I've got a Secretary of Energy who, prior to being the Secretary of Energy, was at MIT, where he was, writing reports like The Future of the Nuclear Fuel Cycle, pointing new research directions for nuclear. If you look at the clean power plan that the administration put out recently, there's a role for nuclear in there, recognition that either power up rates of existing facilities or construction of new nuclear power plants can be part of a state meeting its carbon reduction goals. And so I'd say there's actually been broad support for advancing nuclear technology within this administration.
Now, you have really high hopes for nuclear energy in the future, for INL in the future, but when it comes to your job, when it comes to the nuclear industry, what keeps you up at night?
What I worry about in the relatively near term is the current plants face some real economic challenges because of low natural gas prices, because of some of the favorable treatment that renewables have gotten in terms of from a pricing perspective. You see reactors, particularly in the Midwest and the Northeast, that are in very, very challenging economic environments, and I worry about losing that low carbon generation, which you'd have to expect would be replaced by natural gas in at least some, if not most instances. And what does that do to our ability to meet our climate goals over the long, in the near term and then over the long term? In the long run, I think nuclear has a lot of potential. As I mentioned, it's already 20% of U.S. electricity. We're seeing great interest in nations like China and India, ensuring that the U.S. remains engaged, involved, so that our norms when it comes to safety behaviors and non-proliferation behaviors become kind of the accepted world standard as we see other nations becoming bigger and bigger players in nuclear power. Those are some of the things I'm most focused on.
All right. Well, that's all the time we have. Thank you so much, John Kotek, Acting Assistant Secretary for the Office of Nuclear Energy. Thank you for your time.
Thanks very much.
Check out our website, become a friend on Facebook, or follow us on Twitter.